took me a while to understand why didn't people do, what seemed so obvious to do. Because not everyone is situated in a way to take advantage of opportunity. But you have to understand that that's a response to this overarching structural experience that people have had, and it makes sense for them, from their perspective, to respond in the way they do. Of course, those with greater access are also differentially affected. And oftentimes they believe it's their own efforts that created all the advantages that they have, right? And so we see people in power, white people, becoming more grandiose and narcissistic and thinking, that they can make regime change in another country or something like that. They have every right to do that because, after all, they're self-made, right? All the advantages they had came to them. So, because structure and agency have this mutual, recursive, interactive relationship, we have to realize that that's an important part to consider in structural change. Now, you might think, once a person or a community has difficulty accessing agency, can that ever change? Yes, it can. They change when they have new, more positive experiences of social interaction. They create new implicit associational links that reshape their view of themselves and their self-affectance. It doesn't happen the first time. It has to happen again and again. But as people have different kinds of experience in interaction, they can reshape the way they see themselves because it arises out of their interaction with the world around them. And you can challenge their old patterns and beliefs. And structural forms, as you know, are very persistent, especially the deeply layered structural forms that have been around a long time and they have broad-ranging effect. And one of the main reasons political scientists and social scientists think they're so resistant to change is because they are engaged in this process called path dependence. In a path-dependent process, a first step in a particular direction induces further steps in the same direction because the consequences of that step make that path more attractive for the next step. That makes sense? You know this intuitively, and maybe you just haven't called it path-dependent. Path-dependent processes are said to have increasing returns for that reason, right? Because the probability and relative benefits of further steps along the path increases the more you go down that path. And in path-dependent processes are inflexible, notably inflexible. Because the further you are into the path or the process, the more difficult and costly it is to change. And people say, well, I can't do that because it will cost too much. You have to do too many things. And sequencing matters in a path-dependent process. Because you can see the first few steps matter a lot more to the final path than the later ones. And path-dependent processes are self-reinforcing. The accumulation of those effects generates a powerful, virtuous, or vicious, depending on your idea of the outcome, cycle of self-reinforcing activity. So this gives us some sense of how these structural elements reinforce one another and how people reinforce the structures themselves over and over again. And I'm going to show you the sort of classic conceptual model of this path-dependent process, and then go on to show you a couple of practical examples. Okay? So the conceptual model is called the Polya-urn process. This shows this logic that we've just been describing. You start off with an urn. My idea of an urn. You can't see into it, but I'm going to show you what's inside of it. 2 balls. And you reach in there randomly. You can't see inside. You take out 1 ball. It's going to be either a red ball or a blue ball, right? And what you do is You put that ball back in the urn, you take another ball of the same color and add that to the urn too. That's the logic of the process, right? Now when you reach in there randomly, the chances are you're more likely to pick a blue ball, right? So when you replace that, now you have more, right? Of course, sometimes you're going to pick a red ball. This is a random pick. But as you go through the process again and again, and then you go through it 1,000 times, you'll reach some equilibrium point where there's the same proportion of red balls to blue balls, no matter what you do. And any ball that you draw and follow the pattern, it won't make any real difference in the overall proportion of red balls and blue balls. Now I'm going to show you a couple of these famous examples of this. The first is the QWERTY keyboard. This QWERTY keyboard was among many keyboards that were invented when typewriters came into existence. Each typewriter manufacturer had their own keyboard. But at that time, typewriters were in their infancy, and if you happened to type two letters that were next to each other, when you were typing an English word, let's say, you were much more likely to have the keys jam. And this QWERTY keyboard has to be set up in a way that the words in the English language that you would be typing are much less likely to have letters that are right next to each other on the keyboard. So it didn't jam as much, and it began to be adopted. Well, meantime, people were able to overcome the problem of jamming keys, so you didn't need that. And other people were able to invent keyboards that actually allowed you to type faster because of the layout of the keys. This is not the most effective layout of the keys for speed, if they don't jam. But by that time, all the people had adopted this keyboard, people had learned the keyboard, the typing schools were teaching the all the textbooks were in it. So it became the winner in this. And so you see that you have a potential inefficiency built into path-dependent processes where sometimes the most efficient model doesn't win out in the long run for various reasons because what drove it in the first place changed. See that? And we still have this today on our computers, even though there's not much chance that many things happen to computers, but the keys don't usually jam. Right? Another example of path dependence is cluster-based development. Silicon Valley started more or less by accident. The man who invented the microchips, William Shockley, actually lived in Bell Labs, was at Bell Labs in New Jersey. He thought of making a plant to manufacture microchips. So he looked around for investors. He looked at various electronics firms. And all the ones on the East Coast, well, he was a difficult person. And all the plans he had fell through. He finally was able to work out something with Beckman, which is in California. And they set up the first microchip manufacturing company in Silicon Valley in California. Naturally, that brought a bunch of technology experts to the area to work in that manufacturing firm. It brought ancillary services that made parts and provided support services for the production and all that. So naturally then that drew more microchip and later technology companies to the area to take advantage of the resources that were there. So now we have this intense concentration there of this cluster of companies. So you can see that path dependence tends to lock in a particular arrangement, even though it might have originated by accident, like the Silicon Valley, or it might have, the factors that gave rise to it long since went away. And as Paul Pearson points out, structural forms that include political processes and policies are particularly susceptible to increasing returns because, first of all, they involve collaborative activity. So you get complementary configurations of institutions. You think about the military contractors that all spring up around some new initiative or some new airplane or something like that. And then, of course, they gain advantage by complementing the political process. They involve extensive policy arrangements that shape the initiative, incentives, and resources of the actors, right? So we have interest groups forming what they do based on what the policies are, and then pushing the policies in ways that push the interest groups. You get the feedback. And, that's my shaping. And political authority has a central role in political processes, and that tends to magnify power asymmetries over time. Those who have access to power then are able to gain, and then because they gain, then they get more powerful, and then they have more access. And so, well, that's my power asymmetries, okay? In fact, when this process is going on, it gets harder and harder to tell cause from effect. Who did what, what started what? Because it's all this self-reinforcing cyclic process, recursive enactment. And in fact, even the way the political world is understood is subject to path dependence. And this is some of what Susan's talking to you about. Confirming information tends to be incorporated, as she amply showed, and people don't, the other stuff falls into the swamp. And you get a whole community of discourse in the political world, in the policy and institutional world, that tend to share and keep reproducing the same ideology. And we had a great example of that. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission called in all these bankers, the heads of all the big investment banks, and they asked them what caused the financial crisis, okay? Well, this guy from J.P. Morgan Chase said his bank never considered a possibility of a large decline in home prices.
Give him a bonus.
Right, I mean, they didn't even make models of the possibility that this was a bubble. They just seemed to assume that the housing prices would keep going up, even though there are many people, there are even investors who are taking advantage of the fact that they knew this was a bubble. And the man in the street was saying, look, I mean, these prices can't go up forever, right? We were all saying that. But they didn't model it. And in fact, maybe they were just ingenuous, but they said it under oath. The guy from Goldman Sachs compared the financial crisis to a hurricane. Nobody could have predicted. In fact, he said it was like an act of God. The head of the commission said this was an act of men and women. So on the national macro level, getting back to our path dependence, these interconnections between economic, political, and social structures create a powerful lock-in that strongly resists change.